just give a brief introduction. Again, I think I saw most of you at the talk at 1 o'clock, but we have Dr. Oliver Sacks with us today, a neurologist, author, and his talk was on creativity. And I thought that we could, Terri and I might be able to, I forgot to introduce Terri, I'm sorry. I'm joined by Terri Bonebright, who's a professor in the psychology department, whose specialty is in cognitive psychology, sensation and perception. And Terri taught a course in intelligence and creativity fairly recently. And I thought that we could start with perhaps a couple of questions for Dr. Sacks and then open it up to the audience so that you guys could ask your questions. And I guess, Dr. Sacks, one of my first questions would be, you seem to emphasize the organic nature of creativity. And if it's organic, is there any way to teach creativity or to at least set up the conditions to facilitate creativity?
Well, I would first sort of put the reverse and say the thing to avoid is inhibiting creativity, and I think there are all sorts of situations which sort of disallow it or make it more difficult because the solution demanded or the answer demanded is already of a particular sort and doesn't give much choice. I think somehow sort of originality has to be welcomed and rewarded and be seen as fun. I think the idea of fun and play and freedom is tremendously important. And although it's difficult to sort of schedule those, and but I'll wander back to the question somehow.
Well, my question is actually one of a bit of a different nature. You were making illusions and actually...
By the way, are we audible?
Yes. Okay, good.
Easier to hear in
Good
here.
question.
Yeah.
You made reference to Coleridge. And there was a book written recently by Kay Redfield Jamison called
yes.
Touch with Fire.
Indeed.
Where she talks about the interconnection between manic depression and artistic temperament. And she does case studies talking about these particular folks, and Coleridge was one of those. Are you familiar with her work?
Yeah, I know Kay Redfield Jamison. I know her autobiography. She is manic depressive herself, and has sort of both used and transcended that condition in a remarkable way. In Touched by Fire, I get the feeling that she goes a bit too far, because it's almost, well, I sometimes feel she's saying you can't be creative unless you're hypermanic. And although I think some of her calendars are very, very impressive about the coincidence of elated states with creativity, I think one could have many calendars in the other direction. Again, I think creativity induces elation, and there is the joy and the excitement of discovery, of innovation, of something new, of getting it, of finding the solution, and that itself can create a high. You don't have to be high first. In general, people have always argued about the relation or otherwise between pathology and creativity. We were talking a little earlier at lunchtime. This was very much an issue at the beginning of the last century, when Goethe felt that creativity was a form of health, of exuberance, of positivity, of too muchness, and Schiller had the opposite feeling. And on one occasion, Goethe went near Schiller's desk and opened a drawer, and the drawer was full of rotten apples. And these disgusted Goethe, but they apparently inspired Schiller. And I think there can be all sorts of very interesting relations between creativity and pathology, and also between creativity and loss. But having said that, I think creativity is unlike mania and unlike Tourette's, and has an extraordinary sort of freedom and fluency and depth and a feeling quite its own. And so I partly disagree with her.
Let me follow up with a quick question then. Csikszentmihalyi has also written about creativity in a book where he wasn't looking particularly at people who had some kind of psychopathology, but they did a very broad scale look at people who are currently seen as creative in a number of fields, including scientific fields. And what I found was interesting about his book is that he talked more about something that he calls flow, which I think is similar to what you're talking about in terms of the organicness of creativity.
But by the way, how do you pronounce his name?
Csikszentmihalyi.
I spell it. Well,
Actually, I could.
No. Actually, I know how it's spelled. But I've never actually been able. I've never heard the name said before.
I had to practice it. I met him when I was a graduate student, and we practiced it before we met him.
Yeah. No. I like his concept of flow very much. And I was actually thinking of it when I mentioned the Indianapolis race course, and not proceeding in sort of sudden jerks and starts and stops, but a sort of a phraseology which yes, and certainly creativity isn't sort of. The process is very much one of an associative flow, but the association is often of a very unexpected sort. Coleridge was very divided here. On the one hand, he called one of his sons Hartley after the associationist philosopher who, like Hume, had this theory of rather mechanical associations. But Coleridge was also at pains to say that the real force behind associations is always a force of personality, of motive, of emotion, of mood. And I guess, I can't pronounce his name, must say something similar. I sometimes think of flow in neurological circumstances. For example, when people who have Parkinson's may have what's sometimes called a kinetic stutter. Their movements are blocked or sudden and unmusical and unrhythmical, and but say an external source of music, or sometimes imagining music, may enable them to sort of flow. I think animal movement flows. On the other hand, I think that computer iterations don't flow. I think that there is, and the whole nature of continuity is involved.
Well, we'd like to open it up to questions from the audience so that we can give you guys a chance. Ishvan?
This is maybe going in a heterodox direction, but
Good.
do you think that it's possible ever to think of creativity as not a good thing?
Yeah. Well, Plato thought poets should be killed.
There you go.
And that the stability of the state was endangered by non-traditional thoughts. And I think the establishment, whether it's the state or the church, is always a little worried about the heterodox or the heretical or the out of line. And timing may be very crucial. I think one often sees, for example, prematurity in science when striking ideas may or may come about, which can't make it, which can't be received because the canon is too strong. Yeah, I think it's the creators are are both they're the great adventurers of the species, and they're the risk takers. They also put everyone else at risk.
But the way you're phrasing it is that there's those others who the establishment and the monolithic social structure, and they view creativity as bad for interests of their own. But could you imagine contexts in which creativity is not a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I have to work a machine, especially a rather large and dangerous machine, I better have an almost mechanical repetition and an automatic quality to it, and not but there's I think that creative periods in the individual or the culture for that matter, but creative periods may need to be followed by some consolidation and stabilization. And I think perhaps one of the things about mania or hypermania, if it goes too far, is there may be so many new ideas or new revelations that one is driven into a sort of chaos. I also think that some sober, analytic, experimental, verifying, falsifying sort of faculty needs to be as strong. Darwin describes nicely how he is always being carried away by new ideas. For example, do cabbages respond to music? I mean, that was one of them. But then he does experiments, and I think there's a danger that one can be sort of carried away too much. I think that one needs to explore the new idea deeply. But I may be still missing what you're saying.
Well, I'm just it seems that one of the implications of your talk was, and your comments here too, is that there is this glorious human capacity or faculty to create, and there are forces that, or kinds of education, or there are various things that can be done to sort of moderate it or stifle it or whatnot, but that basically it is this glorious, fundamentally positive thing. In fact, one of the most positive things. And my sort of dialectical, I have a dialectical reflex that says that, well, in fact, we live in an age when there's self-help books on creativity constantly, which in many ways seem to be reinforcing a certain kind of class and sort of a certain cultural comfort. And I'm just wondering whether there isn't a shadow side to the cult of creativity. Coleridge's name has come up many times, and we can think of the Romantics, and one of the, well, you mentioned Goethe as a kind of an anchor, but one of the big criticisms of the Romantics was that they were into the creative to the point where nobody was taking care of business. I don't mean business, but that there is an element, and if you think of something like Buddhism and meditation or meditative traditions, creativity should not come into meditation. That acceptance and acknowledgement of reality may be as important as a creative modification.
Well, I don't think creativity denies reality, although sort of fantasy or daydreaming may. One of the things which occurred to me as you were talking is the essentially amoral nature of creativity, I've just been reading the making of the atomic bomb, and in a way how the how the amoral sort of creative achievements sort of created such a dangerous situation, and one which then caused a lot of guilt and uneasiness. No, I mean, let's come back to what you say sometime, because I'm really not quite sure what where it's leading, and although perhaps not, I find myself thinking of the Joyce Carey book, The Horse's Mouth, which is a wonderful picture of a selfish, reckless, brilliant, egocentric artist who in a way sacrifices all sorts of human relations and other realities to his art. But I think that may be a different. Or for that matter, some of the recent biographies of Einstein and the publication of his letters, and the way in which his first wife, as it were, felt felt she was finally reduced to a sort of who was herself at first a moderately creative person. I think Einstein hoped to collaborate with her, but later she was really just used, to feed the man and keep house for him, and he no longer seemed to be loving or anything else. But I mean, there are certainly dangers of all sorts involved, but whether that's what you're talking about, I don't know. But let's sort of move around a bit.
My question is sort of going back to the earlier discussion, or the connection between the artistic temperament or creative temperament and pathology in a way. And what I'm interested in is what you feel, or sort of information you could give about the biological connection or base of what could be a creative mentality or the process of creation. And sort of why I think about this, I'm giving a little bit of history just because I don't really know what I'm talking about. So.
None of us know what we're talking about.
A few years ago in a seminar that I had, a task of mine was to look into the Bloomsbury group, which was, I'm sure you're probably familiar with, like Virginia Woolf and Lyndon Strachey and the like, these very, very creative people who sort of lived in this society outside to themselves. And so the tack that my friend and I took looking into it, we sort of wanted to find some similarities between all these people. And one of the poignant examples was they all expressed some sort of form of homosexuality. And so from there, this sort of took us into looking between connections. We read some essays talking about studies of certain aspects of the mind that could have been partial or like exhibited to homosexuality in some way. There was a discussion of a neocortex, and I'm not exactly sure what that is, but sort of the idea was that there was this sort of thing in the mind of these people that allowed them different sets of antonyms or different ways of organizing information, or more complex ways of organizing information than normal people have, which sort of could have lent towards some creative temperament in some way, or ability to make connections between things that most people couldn't see. And so that's kind of why I'm curious, because I didn't exactly know what that was. But if there is some sort of, in your research and study, the biological base behind the creative process.
Well, first I tend to think of the Bloomsbury group in most of them originally met in Cambridge as part of the Apostles, which was a society of original people, which had been set up in the 1840s or so. It was a particular time in history, something which Maynard Keynes talks about very strongly, is how G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica had come out at the beginning of the century, and how much this influenced them all. Amongst other things, Moore has theories of freedom. He doesn't exactly have theories of sexuality, and I think Moore himself was as far as I know, was a rather unworldly, almost monk-like person, but perhaps he wasn't himself exactly part of the Bloomsbury group. I agree. It's a sort of fascinating group to look at, and especially to see people as various as Keynes and Strachey and Russell and Duncan Grant and But I doubt if there was any sort of any sort of single simplifying sort of biological similarity like homosexuality, if indeed homosexuality is biologically determined and not heterogeneous, as I think it is. I think the Bloomsbury group were extremely different in personality, character, and biology, and there was just an amazing sort of cultural sort of coincidence. It was a particular time. I mean, I think the Bloomsbury group is more interestingly looked at as a particular sort of time in culture and England, and sort of before the First World War. D.H. Lawrence hated them. He fulminated violently about them. But I mean, I think that's probably more interesting than any biological hypothesis.
But in your talk today, you said something about if you had another hour,
Yes.
you would want to talk about the neurology that may be underlying creativity.
Did I say that?
Yes.
Something I had half wanted to do, and one or two of the case histories in Mars sort of are in that direction. I'd actually wanted to write a series of studies or essays about artists or creators with pathologies, or shall I say, or dispositions or predilections of various sorts, and how these might be significantly related. For example, one of my subjects, who's really now a good friend, is a mathematician artist who says that he was driven into art by his Parkinsonism. Incidentally, there is an article about him, which is either in the Current or a forthcoming New Yorker, which no, we really know very little about the neurological basis of creativity. There have been a lot of things going on about Einstein's parietal lobes. If they were relevant, I think they were necessary, but certainly not sufficient. Parietal lobes don't. You may need such parietal lobes, but parietal lobes alone won't make an Einstein. There may be lots of people with such parietal lobes and perhaps certain Einstein-like skills who are not Einstein. The extraordinary tenacity and curiosity and stubbornness and obstinacy, which also had some of its negative aspects with his sort of refusal to accept quantum mechanics and this and that. One is not going to be able ever to reduce genius or creativity to purely biological considerations, but nothing can be reduced to purely biological considerations. I mean, they're always sort of historical and cultural things. And similarly, I would think with the so-called biological bases of ADD or impulse disorder or homosexuality or schizophrenia or alcoholism or manic depressive, I mean, at most there may be a slight disposition in that direction, which will then require all sorts of environmental and cultural sort of reinforcers and deprivations. And I've lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
We'll go to another question then. Student behind Dan, and then Dan.
Based on this, in your opinion, would creativity lie more inherently in like a flowing spontaneity or an analytical process? You know, kind of
A flowing spontaneity or what?
analytical process. You know, more of an Eastern versus Western thought view. Which do you think creativity lends itself more to?
I think you have to have both. As partly sort of coming back to your colleague's question, I think there has to be a sober, analytic, critical sort of appraisal of what one is doing, and sort of holding the form. There's an interesting book written by a Parkinsonian psychologist called Ivan. Both the psychologist and the book are called Ivan. But I corresponded with him at one point. It's a very interesting book, and he says that he would do the writing when he was in a way rather high on L-DOPA and had a lot of energy and exuberance, and it would sort of burst out and sometimes be over-rich in associations and excursions and diversions of one sort and another, but then he would edit it off L-DOPA when he was in a sober, analytic sort of mood. And I think all of us have to sort of, have to have the same combination. Now, but analysis alone can constrict one too much, and sort of and sort of prevent one getting anywhere. And exuberance can sort of go too far in the other direction. Yeah, and I think you have to have some sort of balance. And someone mentioned Beethoven earlier, and you certainly see the both the sort of Promethean, bursting out of new ideas, and also how tormentedly he goes over them and analyzes them and evaluates them, deletes many of them, throws them out, repositions them. It's a complex business.
I keep thinking of a quote by Linus Pauling where he was talking about the key to his success was generating many ideas, but then figuring out which ones were worth pursuing. Mm-hmm. So there you have that same contrast. Yeah.
Dan?
I had two questions, and they're completely different. One is something if I ever had the opportunity to ask you this question when I was reading your books in the 80s, I always wanted to. So let me start with that one. It's a metaphysical question. I know you speak a lot about the relationship of the brain to the body, about identity and recognition, but I don't remember anywhere in your books you actually sort of come out and say what you think mind is, or even if there is such a thing as mind. Going back to the question that Ryle asked in the 1950s, is there such a thing, and if there is, what is it? That's the first question, what I always wanted to ask. And the second one,
let me write these down for you.
more in line with, I actually want to sort of go back to what Ishvan raised, is, I guess you might call it junk psychology, I'm not sure what you call it, but there's a lot of things in literature that talk about either genius coming as a reaction to some malady. For example, Walter Kaufmann in his book on Hegel talks about the writing of the phenomenology as Hegel working out his own Oedipal complex with the death of his sister. Or that genius leads to madness. Hollingsdale, on his life of Nietzsche, talks about the very creative work of Nietzsche led to his madness. Or Heidegger, writing on the poet Frederick Hoderlin, talks about this exuberant poetry actually precipitates the madness of Hoderlin. And I'm curious if there's any reality to that, or is that just people being overly imaginative?
Well, let me address your second question first. the there is more than a suggestion that Nietzsche had neurosyphilis. At least this is the, amongst other things, this is the hypothesis which Thomas Mann follows in Dr. Faustus. And one knows that in 1888, really in his final year of intact life, there was a rising excitement, and then in Turin or wherever, towards the end of December, something suddenly happened, and he had some sort of attack. He fell in the street, he grabbed hold of a horse to, and after that. Now, he did not just go psychotic. He had a progressive brain disease, he became paralyzed, he became aphasic. As you know, he lived another 10 years after this. In the thinking itself, although obviously there are various extravagances of one sort or another, I think he was an unbelievably incisive and clear and logical as well as inspired thinker. I think it's not like mad thinking, and I don't think that creative thinking ever drove anyone mad. Although, if one is, so to speak, on the way to madness, it may not help you, or it may be suborned in the process. Of course, there are people like Strindberg, who are really, I think Strindberg is a sort of schizophrenic genius, and I think the same may be true of Hölderlin. I don't know how to pronounce his name. The Cantor, the mathematician, was greatly attacked when he was developing his theories of transfinite numbers, and finally had periods of madness when he had to be institutionalized. In those periods, he felt that he was being held captive by an enemy mathematician, and it was only when these periods resolved that he was able to become creative again. But I'm sort of I think that for every figure you can give me in whom some ominous pathology seems to go along, I think I could give you 20 figures in whom this is not the case. Now, coming to your first question, minds. Well, of course they're mine. What was your question?
Is there a mind?
Is there a mind? Well, let's put it this way. We, by introspection, all of us decide that we have a mind, a sort of cogito ergo sum, and we feel ourselves as perceiving, acting, feeling, thinking creatures. We assume or infer or hope or fear that it is the same with others. Although autistic people may find it difficult to imagine this, also I think when one is depressed, one may sometimes find it difficult to imagine it. Also as a philosophical exercise, in his second meditation, Descartes says he's looking down from a window, seeing what would seem to be people walking around, but how does he know that they are not puppets actuated by strings and wheels and so forth? But I think we can't avoid the word minds. But it may be that one shouldn't reify that one should, for example, the psychologist Bartlett avoided the word memory. He wrote a book called Remembering. And it may be that if one uses sort of verbs like thinking and remembering and imagining and perceiving, that this makes sort of discourse easier. But but clearly we experience and we generalize from our experiences, and perhaps we learn from our experiences, and our experiences are colored by individual values and saliences which are unique to each person. And so finally a body of mental dispositions and knowledge and is developed in everyone, which we can call a mind. But what did you mean by what would seem to be a strange question?
For example, Gilbert Ryle says
Yes.
that there is no such thing as a mind. It's a linguistical term that we happen to use. If we talk about a mind, we must have talked about a brain.
All right. Well, the and Gilbert Ryle talks about the ghost and the machine. No, I mean I think all forms of dualism are going to get one into trouble of some sort of immaterial ghost in a mechanical body, and there's obviously an intimate and inseparable connection between brain and mind. And every mental state must, in some sense, go along with a brain state, although not necessarily the same brain state or one which would mean the same in another brain or whatever. So obviously, I can't imagine what would be meant by a disembodied mind, or a disembodied anything for that matter. But as you know, the sort of history of philosophy and psychology is sort of full of all theories of dualism and epiphenomenalism and psychophysical parallelism and so forth. I'm slightly intrigued by the philosopher Colin McGinn, who has sometimes suggested that although obviously the subjective arises naturally and by a natural process from brain, from what is going on in nerve cells, nonetheless we will never be able to bridge the seeming gap because we don't have the cognitive equipment. He sometimes likes to speak of cognitive closure. Darwin once said that man can no more divine the mind of God than a dog could understand the mind of Newton. And Colin McGinn likes to say, we may be well equipped for other mental processes. We are getting, say, pretty close to the origin of matter, to understanding the origin of the universe and the origin of life, but we have got nowhere since Aristotle in understanding the origin of subjectivity, and maybe we're incapable of the needed concepts. I sort of don't know where I stand about that. Although in some sense, sort of I don't find that physiological knowledge in the least diminishes the impact or the wonder of the subjective. For example, I'm interested in color. I'm interested, say, in stereoscopic vision. I know something of the mechanisms and the iterative algorithms which the brain by which the brain infers depth. But the experience of depth for me is absolutely magical. And if I close one eye and lose it, I feel it as a sharp deprivation, and I open the other eye, and I don't say, "Gosh, what a nice iterative algorithm." So there are such different sort of realms of discourse, And I don't know about the bridging, although I'm sure that, that one needs as much neuroscience on the one side and as much phenomenology on the other side as possible.
I don't want to neglect this side of the room.
Thank you. During the time I've heard
Louder.
Okay. During the time that I've heard you speak today, I've known you that you're a very dynamic person, Dr. Sachs, and I appreciate having the opportunity to view with you the position on creativity of the brain. However, my question is addressed towards your following book, The Man Who Mistakes His Wife for a Hat. In my following class, some of my classmates feel that your attitude towards your patient is not that of sincere. We notice that you use a humorous tone when you're dealing with your patient.
Wait, I'm not quite hearing you.
Okay, we view that you approach your patient's disability with a humorous tone, yet one can feel that you're also condescending the patient. Could you just please clarify your position or your attitude towards your patient and your relationship with them?
I don't enter upon an encounter with a patient with any predetermined attitude. I hope my attitude is one of attention and interest and curiosity and respect. I want to know what things are like for them. As a doctor, as a clinician, I need to use the technical term, to elicit various symptoms and signs, to make an examination, to try and decide what is going on, and possibly to sort of suggest some mode of treatment. But so far as I'm concerned, that's only the beginning. I mean, I can spot someone with Parkinsonism a mile off, and I know something about what goes on with neurotransmitters and the basal ganglion, what will happen if you give L-DOPA and so forth. But also, and equally, I want to know what it's like to be Parkinsonian, the challenges he will meet, say, in trying to stand up or in trying to walk, and some of the strategies which might be developed. Now, I am balanced somewhere, or ideally I should be balanced, between an investigative and a therapeutic role. I think there is a danger sometimes of pushing too far of being pushed too far by one's own curiosity and traumatizing a person or frightening them. For example, in the case of the Lost Mariner, this I think when I suddenly showed a mirror to this man, and to this 50-year-old man, and said, "Is that a 19-year-old?" I think this was very shocking. Fortunately, it was forgotten in a few seconds, but it was. I think I was a bit moved towards a sort of dramatic gesture, and it wasn't the tenderest thing to do. I think that a sort of humor, if it's a laughing with and not a laughing at, is perfectly permissible and sometimes desirable in a clinical situation. Again, in my writings about patients, there is a very delicate line, of course, but perhaps I need to say that beside the investigator and the doctor, there's obviously a writer somewhere who is sort of I won't say looking for a story, but is not insensitive to the possibilities of a story. But if so, I think it's a story which needs to be couched in the mode of appreciation and of respect, and not one of exploitation. but these are all delicate things, and I think I've sometimes, as you are perhaps suggesting, overstepped the line here and there, and I only hope that I do it less now than I used to.
Adding on to that, I'm also here as
So I can't hear you.
Okay.
Can you stand up and speak loudly?
Okay, adding on to that, I'm also I'm a psychology student and in the same writing class as her. And in reading your essays, I noticed that you put like a story to it. But I was also wondering the effect that it has to have on you psychologically, dealing with these extraordinary patients every day, and to have them also going on a lot of these with the postscripts. It pretty much ends after maybe after a few meetings. You know, there's nothing found to help this person. Now they go on and lead the rest of their life. I was wondering if you have to desensitize yourself to them.
If I what?
Have to desensitize yourself to them as people, or is them as the disease that takes them over as people? I was wondering how you handle that, and in the writing, as she noticed that there's a controversy in my class over how you feel with the students, if you see the patients, if you see them as people that you want help and find things to help them, or as the disease that they have, and how you personally can find out more about it, like whether it's for their benefit or yours.
First, I'm not quite sure how to organize an answer, but first, many neurological conditions tend to be incurable or chronic or sometimes advancing. Occasionally, say as with the awakenings patients, one may be able to find a medication which can make a great deal of difference to the way people feel and function, even if it doesn't alter the basic process. But sometimes one can't do that. So there may be, I want to say, a certain grimness or sadness built into the situation. But having said that, I think there are always ways of coping, of making something of a life, and sometimes a very rich life, despite the restrictions of the pathology, and increasing, and basically in my daily work, this is what I'm concerned with. Yes, you may be in a wheelchair, you may be blind, you may be deaf, but still you can have a very full life, and let's explore how. You use the word desensitize, or at least I think you use the word desensitize. I had a cousin whom I'm very close to who had a stroke, became aphasic. I saw her a few hours after this, and she was screaming like a soul in hell. The expression, like a soul in hell, immediately came to me. I was haunted by this for 2 or 3 weeks. I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining myself in her position. I thought if I reacted to my patients the way I reacted to her, I would be undone as a doctor. And I think the terms which need to be used, and the word desensitize, I think sort of blurs that distinction. I think one needs to be as sympathetic or empathic as possible to try and project yourself imaginatively into the person's state without losing yourself. I think one mustn't identify. Now, I once had a clinical situation. I might say it was one in which I was oversensitive or hypersensitized. This was 25 years ago when I was working with a ward of youngsters, some were autistic, some were psychotic, and I thought the ward itself and the mode of therapy was very abusive. It was a so-called behavior mod ward, and it used what was called therapeutic punishment. And this reminded me overwhelmingly of a very traumatic period in my own growing up. And I found myself almost helplessly identifying with these youngsters and forgetting my medical and my adult status. I think this this undid me, and it undermined me, and I sort of got out of that situation as soon as possible, because really I was no use in it. It is no use identifying. It is every use empathizing. But in empathy, although you will share the world and the emotions and the perspective of someone as much as possible, you remain yourself. You are still Dr. Sachs, grown up. You have not yourself regressed to a terrified 8-year-old. And you must have this sort of detachment combined with this sort of sympathy. Otherwise, you can't work as a doctor.
Bruce?
Do you have a feeling of what happens to the sense of self when someone has a neurological disease such as Parkinson's?
The sense of self. Well, I think all sorts of things can happen with it. Mostly, I'm impressed by how some sense of self survives all sorts of neurological disasters and diseases, even diffuse, degenerative, dementing diseases. I get the feeling that self is very robustly and widely and deeply represented in the nervous system as it has to be, and that even if some layers of self have disappeared, other ones are there. So that, for example, in people with Alzheimer's disease, even if you can't communicate or call to them verbally or conceptually, you may be able to do so at the level of music or art or gesture, or they still tend to be themselves. I had a colleague who wrote a book about Alzheimer's, and for some reason I said to her, "Don't call your book The Loss of Self." And for some reason she called her book The Loss of Self. Although, in fact, her book is very much about the resilience and the survival of self, at least until the cortex and consciousness and the mind and the person is almost wiped out. But until very, very late, I think some sense of self is still there. Now, I think that this may then be slightly well, not in contradiction, at an angle to this. I think the sense of self may be suborned somewhat in some circumstances. For example, people with Tourette's. Another colleague of mine has written a delightful book about Tourette's called A Mind of Its Own. And in Tourette's, it's almost as if there is an accessory personality of a rather impulsive sort, and especially if one develops Tourette's when one is young, I think this can be intertwined with one's own. There's a sort of Siamesing or growing together. I know one patient who wrote to me and said he had a Touretteized soul, but the Tourette's exerts some influence on one's identity, but one's identity exerts some influence on the Tourette's. So I mean, it's a complicated sort of situation, and again, there are all sorts of adaptations. For example, with regard to the painter whom I wrote about, who became suddenly totally colorblind. Since color had been a crucial vehicle for him in ordering the world and painting the world, and was full of value and emotion, he felt the loss of color first as absolutely devastating. He felt it as a loss of identity, a loss of his art, a loss of his life. He felt suicidal. But then, although he never recovered any perception of color or any memory or imagination of color, the black and white world, which has seemed so depleted and abnormal and impoverished, started to be charged again with beauty and interest and meaning, and he returned to his art. So in some sense, at one level, one might have said, you know, he lost his, you know, his color identity. But there was some other creative identity, I think, which was able to bridge over for him. I think that in all sorts of diseases and conditions, there can be a terrible intermediate state, a sort of limbo, in which you have lost one way of perception, or one form of communication, or you can't move the way you usually did, or you can't interact, and that is sort of terrible and hell. But then you may discover or construct or be helped to find another one. And so, but I agree with, I think, the implication of your question that every experience of disease and every encounter with disease is also a test of identity, one way and another. This was especially striking, say, with the post-encephalitic patients, the awakenings patients, you know, who had suddenly fallen through a vacuum from their 20s to their 60s and sort of came to in their 60s with an identity formed 40 years earlier and appropriate to the 1920s. And then, in a way, they had to reform a new one.
I didn't know if you were familiar.
You need to speak up.
Oh, are you familiar with the movie House of Cards?
With the movie?
House of Cards.
No.
Oh, anyway, it's this girl who was traumatized by witnessing her father's death.
Uh-huh.
And she sort of went into this autistic state where she didn't communicate. All she did was build these enormous house out of cards with like pictures of her father and things that she had seen and done with her father. And her mother didn't know what to do, so she took her to this place, like an autistic hospital, where some kids like talked, they communicated in prime numbers. And when she was put into this room with the window, she took finger paints and painted her body to be camouflaged with the tree in the window, and so she was sort of invisible. And she didn't talk or anything until her mother built this huge house of cards that she had been building, and all of a sudden she snapped out of it and began communicating, but she had no recollection of anything that she had done. Is this her building of cards and stuff in this autistic state? Is this thought of as creativity?
Well, first, I don't know the film. Second, I would think that it's describing a psychosis of some sort, and not an autistic state. I think that in a psychosis, where a vital relationship and a world, in a way, has been lost, I think that that many of the activities in a psychosis, including some of the paranoias and things, have a constructive function. I think that in psychoses, as in dreams, one is thinking in deeply symbolic ways, and you know, and the you know, the house of cards becomes some way of representing what's going on. I really don't have much experience in this direction, but I think that that it has to be a very exceptional and valuable sort of person or therapist who can deal with the remote and strange and almost hieroglyphic world of the deeply psychotic and sort of take them through it. But I don't know the film, and I sort of can't say more.
I think we have time for one more question. Susan?
I think you said,
Loud.
I think you said it was Stephen that had the talent for drawing, replicating, and I think you implied he was autistic. And if you could cure his autism, I assumed it had a neurological base, would then his talent go away? So you could perhaps make him creative, but he would lose the talent. So away from him, but would you have a moral dilemma? Or would he?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and that was at several levels. It was raised in regard to a prodigiously gifted little Ukrainian girl called Nadia, who was the subject of a book in I think in '77. Nadia, at the age of 3, was doing sort of drawings which would not have disgraced the 20-year-old Picasso. There were sort of bullfighters and footballers and boxers, full of life and with remarkable sort of perspective and detail. At that time, Nadia was mute and inaccessible and appeared not to notice people. I mean, and I think on the beach she would sometimes tread on them as if they were just objects. Now, when she acquired some language and some social intelligence, she stopped drawing. And there was, in fact, an interesting review of this published by the novelist Nigel Dennis some years ago, in which he said, what sort of cure is this, that we have cured a genius and left a generally defective, moronic little girl who can do nothing very much. With Stephen Wilshire, there was some thought that as he acquired language and some social skills, his art might suffer, but in fact it hasn't made the least difference. Now, with regard to your question as to whether could one cure the autism but keep the talents, well, we don't know enough about autism. We don't know whether the talents represent, as it were, a fortuitously associated hypertrophy of certain brain centers, or whether, as an investigator called Alan Snyder in Australia has recently suggested, the talents are actually due to the difficulty in generalization and integration and synthesis. Now, for example, Nadia and Stephen, to some extent, almost seem to be able to draw what's on their retina. The rest of us can't. We don't have access to these pre-perceptual stages. Although Alan Snyder does then wonder whether, in fact, we could get access to them somehow. And I think these are open and intriguing questions, and therefore good ones to finish the afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.